Her brother-in-law had given her 3 days to clear out her things. She had not argued with him. There was no point arguing with a man who had already decided, who stood in the doorway of the house she had lived in for 6 years, with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor. She had looked past him at the kitchen, at the table where her husband used to sit with his coffee going cold, and she had counted what she owned and what she did not. What she owned: a trunk, a wool coat, a cast-iron skillet her mother had sent from Ohio, and $41 folded into a handkerchief inside her boot. What she did not own: the house, the land, the mule, the debt her husband had left behind. She took the trunk and the coat and the skillet and left before the 3rd day. The town of Callow Creek was not much: a main street with a saloon and a dry goods store and a land office with a cracked front window, a livery at the south end, a church with no bell. She had passed through it twice before without stopping, once going east with her husband, and once coming back from a funeral that was not his, but might as well have been, for how it changed things. She stopped now. The woman at the boarding house, a Mrs. Finch, round-faced and practical, looked her up and down and asked how long she needed a room. She said she did not know yet. Mrs. Finch set the price and she paid a week in advance without being asked. Mrs. Finch seemed to appreciate that. She showed her upstairs to a room with a window that faced west and a bed that did not creak too badly and a washstand with a pitcher of cold water. She sat on the edge of the bed after Mrs. Finch left and looked at the floor for a while. Then she washed her face and went downstairs. She had heard about the Calder place from a man at the dry goods counter the next morning. She had not been asking about it directly. She had been asking about work, quiet and practical, whether anyone in the area needed a hand. The man behind the counter, whose name was Galt, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, had looked at her the way men looked at women asking practical questions, briefly surprised, then calculating. He said there was the Calder place, out on the north road past the Second Creek crossing. He said the man who ran it, name of Calder, had lost his hired hand to a mining outfit in September and hadn't replaced him. Said Calder kept sheep, some dry goods trading on the side, and that the operation was small enough one person could manage most of it, but large enough that one person alone was wearing thin. She asked if Calder was known to be reasonable. Galt said he was known to be quiet. Said it the way you say something when you don't mean much else by it. She bought a small tin of lard and a box of matches and walked back to the boarding house and sat with it. She had known men who were called quiet. Her father had been called quiet. Her husband had been called quiet. They had been different kinds of quiet entirely. She went anyway. The north road past the Second Creek crossing was exactly as described. She walked it because she had no horse and the stage didn't run that direction. The morning was cold in the way November mornings in that country were cold. Not the sharp cold of a real winter, but the gray, damp cold that got into everything and stayed. The grass was the color of old straw. The creek ran slow and dark between its banks. The Calder place sat at the end of a lane marked by 2 fence posts with no wire between them. The house was small, low-roofed, built from timber that had weathered to a silver gray. The barn behind it was older than the house and listed slightly to the east. A sheep pen ran along the south side, and she counted 14 sheep without meaning to, the way you count things when you are trying to decide something. A man came out of the barn before she reached the house. He was taller than she expected, though she hadn't expected much. Dark-haired, broad through the shoulders, somewhere past 40. He wore no coat in the cold, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected in a place where unexpected things rarely happen. Not alarmed, just still. She told him she had heard he needed help. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked behind her at the lane as though checking to see if there was someone else. There was no one else. He said the work was not light. She said she was not looking for light work. He said the pay was $12 a month and board, and that the board was a room above the barn that was weather-tight but not warm. He said this last part as though it might end the conversation. She said that was fine. He looked at her again. Then he turned and walked toward the house, and she followed, and he held the door without looking back to see if she would come through it, which she did. His name was Calder. She did not learn his given name until the 3rd week, and by then she had stopped being curious about it. He was simply Calder, in the same way that the barn was the barn and the south pen was the south pen. He moved through his place with the efficiency of a man who had organized his life down to its essential functions and did not welcome additional complexity. The room above the barn was as described, weather-tight, not warm. A cot, a nail in the wall for hanging things, a small window that looked out over the sheep pen. She had slept in worse. She had not slept in much better. She rose before light the first morning and found the pen gate, which had a hinge that caught, and she fixed it with a piece of wire before Calder came out of the house. She did not tell him she'd fixed it. She simply fixed it. The second morning, she found a ewe that had separated herself from the flock and stood against the north fence with her head down. She watched the animal for a few minutes and then went and found Calder in the barn and told him which ewe and what she was doing. He said, "You know sheep?" She said she'd grown up with them. He looked at the ewe. He said, "Watch her today." She watched her. By afternoon, the ewe was worse. She went back to Calder and told him, and he came out and looked and said nothing for a while, and then went into the barn and came back with what he needed. They worked over the ewe together for close to an hour in the cold, him holding and her doing most of the detailed work because her hands were smaller. The ewe recovered. He didn't say anything about her hands or about the fact that she had clearly done this before. She didn't either. November passed. She learned the shape of his operation the way you learn any unfamiliar terrain, by walking it, by making small errors and correcting them, by paying attention. He ran 14 sheep down to 12 when he sold 2 in the first week of December. He had a small trading arrangement with the dry goods store in Callew Creek, selling wool and sometimes dried mutton. And there was a kitchen garden on the east side of the house that had gone mostly to ruin after the summer and would need clearing before spring. She looked at the garden the way she had looked at the sheep pen gate. She noted the raised beds, the soil, the direction of morning light. She noted that the soil was good, darker than the surrounding ground, well worked at some earlier point in time. She mentioned it to him one evening when he came in from checking the fence line and she was heating water on the stove. She said the kitchen garden could produce well if it was cleared and turned before the ground froze. He said he knew. She said, "I can do it." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Ground's already close to freezing." She said she could work fast. He looked at her across the kitchen. She had learned by then how he looked at things he was deciding about. There was a quality to his attention that was deliberate without being unkind. He was a man who thought before he answered, which was more than could be said for most. He said, "All right." She cleared the garden in 4 days. It was hard work, cold work, the kind that leaves your hands cracked and your back complaining in the morning. She pulled the dead growth and turned the beds by hand with a fork from the barn, and worked in what compost she could find. She found a pile of rotted straw behind the barn that she hadn't noticed before, and she worked that in too. And by the end of the 4th day, the beds were turned and dark and ready. Calder came and looked at it the evening she finished. He stood at the edge of the garden with his hands in his pockets and looked at it without speaking for long enough that she began to wonder if she'd done something wrong. He said, "Where'd you find the straw?" She told him. He nodded. He said, "I didn't know there was anything usable back there." She said she had gone looking. He nodded again and went inside. She stayed out in the cold a minute longer, looking at the turned beds. Then she went in too. December was hard in a different way than November. The temperature dropped for real in the 2nd week and stayed down. She learned where the barn drafts were and stuffed them with rags. She learned that 2 of the sheep were likely to push through a weak section of the north fence if the weather stressed them, and she reinforced it before they did. She learned that Calder woke before she did, which surprised her, and that he had coffee going before she came down, which he did not offer but also did not withhold. She poured herself a cup the 3rd morning without asking. He was at the table with papers, and he looked up when she did it and then looked back at his papers. She sat across from him and drank her coffee and looked out the window at the gray morning coming up. They sat like that for a while. She had been in the habit with her husband of filling silence with words, of smoothing things over. She had understood too late that she had been smoothing over problems that needed to be looked at directly, not covered. She did not do that anymore. Silence was not the same as trouble. She had learned that slowly and at some cost. Calder did not seem to require filling either. He sat with his papers and she sat with her coffee, and the morning came up outside, and neither of them said anything until there was something to say. There was a problem with the wool. She understood it better than he did, or at least differently, because she had watched him go through his accounts in the evenings, and she had seen where the numbers didn't add up, and she had thought about it for a week before she said anything. She said it one evening in January. The wind was coming hard from the north, and the barn was cold, despite everything she'd done with the drafts. She said the price he was getting from the dry goods store in Callow Creek was low. She said she'd asked Galt, in a roundabout way, what the store was paying for wool from other operations, and the number was higher. Calder looked at her. She said she thought he could be getting more. She said there was also a mill in Denton, 20 miles east, that she'd read was taking direct orders and paying better than the middlemen. He said Denton was 20 miles. She said yes. He said he didn't have the time to deal with Denton. She said she could write the letter if he wanted. She had a clear hand and knew what to ask. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You've done this before." It was not exactly a question. She said, "I helped run the accounts on my husband's operation for 4 years. He said, "What happened to the operation?" She said, "He died. His brother took it." He said nothing to that. There wasn't much to say. He knew the way property moved. Everybody in that country knew it. After a while, he said, "Write the letter." The mill in Denton wrote back in 3 weeks. The price they offered was better. Not extraordinary, but enough to matter. She showed Calder the letter, and he read it twice and set it down on the table. He said, "How did you know to ask the right things?" She said she had made mistakes before and learned from them. He looked at the letter again. Then he looked at her. She had noticed by then how he looked at things he was reconsidering. It was a different look from the one he gave things he was deciding. More internal, like a man doing arithmetic no one else could see. He said, "I didn't hire you for this." She said she knew. He said, "I hired you for the sheep and the general work." She said yes. She waited. He said, "I suppose I should reconsider what I hired you for." February came, and with it the worst of the winter. 3 days of hard freeze that got into the pipes and threatened 2 of the younger animals and sent her out to the barn at 2 in the morning, twice in 1 week. Calder was out there with her both times, neither of them having said they would be, just both of them, arriving in the cold with the same understanding of what needed doing. They saved all 3 of the animals. The second time, after standing in the barn while the wind pushed at the walls and the animals settled back into their warmth, he said, "You don't sleep much." She said, "I sleep enough." He said, "I noticed you checking the barn before you went up the last 3 nights." She said she was in the habit. He said, "It's a good habit." She said she'd come by it the hard way. He didn't ask what the hard way was. She had learned by then that he wouldn't. He was a man who understood that some things were explained by their results and not their origins. She appreciated that about him more than she had expected to. The snow came properly in March, which was late but not unheard of in that part of the country. By then, she had been at the Calder place for 4 months, and she knew every corner of it the way you know a thing when you have worked it in every weather. She had mended the barn roof where it leaked over the east stalls. She had cleared and turned the kitchen garden a second time when the ground allowed, and planted the first cool weather seeds she'd ordered from a catalog she found in the dry goods store. She had reorganized the trading arrangement with Galt so that they were getting a fairer price for the dried goods, and she had written 2 more letters to the mill in Denton and received 2 more letters back, and the arrangement there was working. The place looked different than it had in November. She didn't always see it herself, being inside it, but she saw it sometimes when she walked the lane in the evening and turned back to look. The barn was still listing slightly to the east, but the roof was sound. The sheep pen was solid. The garden was dark and promising. The house had curtains in the windows now, because Mrs. Finch had given her a length of fabric she hadn't wanted, and it had seemed a waste to let it sit. Calder had not said anything about the curtains. She had not asked if they were all right. He had not taken them down. The arrangement between them had settled into something she did not have a precise name for. It was not what she'd had before. It was not what she'd expected when she walked up the lane in November with $41 in her boot and no particular plan beyond the next week. It was something that had built itself quietly, like the garden, from working conditions and common sense and the ordinary passage of difficult days. He paid her on the first of each month. He had started paying her $14 instead of $12 without any discussion. And she had accepted it without comment because she understood it was his way of accounting for the Denton arrangement and the letters and the things she did that were not strictly in the original terms. She wondered sometimes what he made of her. She was not the kind of woman who invited that kind of wondering from men, generally. She had been too direct for some, too capable for others, too quiet for others still. Her husband had valued her capability while being occasionally uncomfortable with it, which she had understood only in retrospect. Calder did not seem uncomfortable. She could not entirely account for that. The thing that changed was small. It was a Tuesday in late March, a clear, cold morning, with the first real light of the year coming in low and bright through the kitchen window. She had come down before him for the first time since November. She had the stove going and the coffee made, and was sitting at the table with the Denton letters and a piece of paper, working through numbers when he came down. He stopped when he saw the coffee. She said, "It's ready." He poured a cup and sat down across from her, as she usually sat across from him. He looked at the letters and the paper. She said, "I think we can increase the order in May. The spring clip will be larger than last year if the flock holds." He said, "The flock will hold." She said, "Then I'll write to them." He said, "All right." She wrote the letter that morning after the sheep were fed. She wrote it at the kitchen table, and he was in and out through the morning, and did not say anything about her being at his table with his paper and his ink, which she had used without asking. She left the letter on the table for him to look at before she sealed it. He read it that evening. He said it was good. He handed it back. She sealed it and set it by the door for the next mail run. He said, "When this goes through, the place will be in better shape than it's been in 3 years." She said, "It's good land. It just needed some attention." He was quiet. Then he said, "Yes." April came the way April comes in that country. Unreliably, one warm day and then a week of cold. The ground thawing in the morning and freezing again at night. She planted more seeds and lost some to a late frost and planted again. She did not complain about the frost. It was country, not a garden party. You planted and waited and planted again if you had to. The kitchen garden came in slow and then all at once, the way things do. She was out there one morning in early May on her knees in the dirt, thinning the carrot seedlings that were coming up crowded on the east side, when she heard him stop at the edge of the garden behind her. She did not look up. He said, "Carrots," she said, "and beets on the other end. Beans when it warms." He said, "There used to be beans here. My wife grew beans." She stopped what she was doing for a moment. He had not mentioned a wife before. She had known there must have been one, had thought it from the way the kitchen was arranged, from small signs, but she had not asked. She said, "I didn't know." He said, 7 years ago, fever." She said, "I'm sorry." He said, she would have liked the beets. She went back to the carrot seedlings. She gave him a minute. Then she said, "What else did she grow?" He thought about it. He said, "Peas and sunflowers along the fence. But I always thought those were more decorative than practical." She said, "They're both. The seeds are useful." He said, "I didn't know that." She said, "Lot of things are more useful than they look." He was quiet. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that neighborhood. And she felt it in her chest in a way that surprised her, so she kept her eyes on the carrots until it passed. The Denton arrangement paid in June. The check came on a Thursday, and Calder brought it inside and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. She was at the stove and she turned and looked too. He said, "This is almost double what I made last June." She said, "Yes." He said, "Because of the Denton arrangement." She said, "Partly. The flock is also healthier. The spring clip was heavier than you expected." He said, "Because of the winter management." She said, "The flock held through a hard winter. That's what healthy animals do." He said, "You managed them through the hard winter." She said, "We both did." He looked at her. She turned back to the stove. He said, "I'm going to write to Denton about a longer arrangement, a 2-year agreement." She said, "That's good. Lock in the price before the market shifts." He said, I'll need you to look over what I write, she said. All right, he said. I'd also like to talk about what your arrangement here is. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what would you like it to be? He said, more permanent if you're willing. She turned from the stove and looked at him across the kitchen. He was standing with the check in one hand and the other hand open at his side, and he was looking at her with the deliberate attention she had come to understand was his way of saying something he meant entirely. She said, I'm willing. He nodded. She nodded. They were quiet for a while. Outside, the summer was coming in through the open door, warm and grass-scented and unhurried, and the sheep were in the pen, and the garden was green and the barn roof was holding. She poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked. He sat down. She sat across from him. The morning light came through the kitchen window, the same window where she had first seen this place in November, and it lay across the table between them like something neither of them needed to name.